Do you want to talk about sex? I love talking about sex. So does my colleague, Melissa Ephard, who is the co-founder of Upstate Mary, a premium, clean, and organic plant-based sexual wellness product line. Melissa and I are gathering together, joining a group of women on January 28th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Gigi's Trattoria in Rhinebeck, New York. We are going to talk about sex, sex products, aging, all accompanied by delicious Gigi's food. And let's just have a good time because when was the last time you got to gather together with a group of women and just talk about sex and intimacy? Please join us. Traveling beyond the familiar, whether it's just to the next state, a new city, or across an ocean, offers most of us a powerful chance for personal and professional growth. Many of the world's great epic stories reflect this truth. The heroine's journey begins when she steps away from her comforts and everything she knows into a landscape filled with wonder, challenge, and discovery. Through those trials, she learns who she is and how she belongs in the wider world. Women around the globe share universal obstacles and prejudices, yet each culture also carries its own history, beauty, and unique strategies for pursuing health and wellness. When we travel, we encounter these differences and similarities firsthand, and that exchange can broaden our understanding of ourselves and our own path to thriving. Welcome to GynoCurious. I'm your host and creator, Dr. Amy Novatt. From both sides of the speculum, we're here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please share the show with others, follow. This helps promote the show, but mostly it helps move the information that I share with you to other women who might not be directly listening. So please give others the opportunity to learn from GynoCurious. I really appreciate your support. You can write to radiofreerhinecliffe.org if you have questions or comments. And if you want to learn about my clinical practice, please go to dramynovatt.com and share that with others as well. And please, while you're listening right now, you have your phone in front of you, your computer in front of you. Do that right now. Go to follow, go to share so that you don't forget. Alrighty, so thank you for listening. Today, I am really thrilled to be speaking with Ruthie Pines. Ruthie is a senior public and community health major at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Ruthie left Ithaca last year and traveled to India, where she studied public health, gender, and sexuality. Today, we're going to talk about what she learned about healthcare abroad and the lessons that she brought home, both for herself and for her community, and to share with us her amazing journey. Welcome, Ruthie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I feel so honored.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I feel honored. So, I'd like to start the show by talking about people's arc. So, when you went off to college, did you know then you were going to study public health?
I did not. So I feel like I had quite the strange high school experience. I mean, with COVID, it obviously could have been
Mm.
worse. I had a high school graduation and a prom, so, some people didn't have that. But I feel that that COVID experience made working in school very difficult for me. I found out that I didn't work from home so well. And so I just didn't work as hard as I could have in high school. So when I got into college, when I got to Ithaca, I had a goal in mind that I would work really hard and just see where that took me. So I started off actually as an exercise science student.
Mm.
Ithaca College has a really great exercise science program and PT program. And I just knew that I loved to exercise. And so I went with what I know. And it was great for the first year. I really loved my classes. I was still kind of exploring different kinds of classes. And then in my sophomore year, I started to wonder what I would do with my exercise science degree, if I wanted to maybe go the physical therapy route or, a coaching kind of career. And it was around that time when I took a human nutrition class. And the professor had a degree, an MPH degree, and she had worked for CDC and HWO, and she had worked in all these different countries doing nutrition programs. And I just thought that that was so cool. And I remember listening to her talk and thinking, I want to be her. I want to explore other countries and learn more about the world. I've just been in my little bubble here, and I've always known that I wanted to do health. And so hearing that and hearing the major impact she's had through her work, I kind of learned what public health was. I didn't really know what it was before. I mean, nobody really teaches you that. And this class really sparked my interest.
Great, great. Well, this is a kind of a good segue because clearly you're someone who's interested in exercise and the body and ways of being healthy. That's implied by that pursuit, and also public health, of course. And I was thinking about, I always think about the body. That's part of what GynoCurious is talking about. And travel and the body is an interesting kind of journey. One of the reasons I love to travel is actually to see how my body responds to new environments. The foods, air travel, trekking in, a different air quality. What gets provoked, what gets healed, what feels good, what feels bad. So I wanted to start with just the body and how it was for you as you decided to go off to India. But maybe let's start with, how did you decide to go to India? And then what was that journey literally when you were going to India and in India, how your body felt?
Yes, that's a great question and a good segue. So I realized that I could go abroad for a little while. I wasn't sure just because I kind of switched into public health a little bit late. I didn't know if I'd have enough time to get in all those credits. And I was looking for different abroad programs that focused on public health, and there really weren't that many. There were
Really?
few, yeah, there were rarely any, shockingly, that I found at least that were affiliated with Ithaca College.
Mm.
And one of the first ones that popped up for me was the one in India. And I remember the moment I saw it in my second semester of my sophomore year, I thought, well, that would be interesting. I've gone overseas before. My stepmom is Filipino, and so I've been to the Philippines. And I remember I went on that trip when I was 10, and that was really hard on my body. I got really sick while I was there. I got my first migraine, which I would struggle with later on. So I was definitely worried. I'm also very afraid of flying on airplanes. I have really bad airplane anxiety. And so there were a lot of things that were pulling me away, but there was something inside that was pulling me towards it. Some sort
Mm.
of curiosity and, the fantasticness of it all, of just, oh, like that would just be such a cool opportunity. I've never had an opportunity like that. And so I let myself have the summer to think about it. And then in the beginning of my junior year, I only applied to two different places. I applied to one in Prague in Czech Republic and the India one. And as soon as I applied to the one in Czech Republic, I thought I actually want to go to India because there really didn't seem like there would be any other time in my life when I could go somewhere and number one, be in a safe community, be surrounded by other people my age and have people in the know around me, like my professors, and also to have that blocked off time where I can just take things in. When else would I have time to do that, especially after I graduate and start my career? And if I go to another country for work, I'm not going to actually see that country.
Mm.
I knew nothing about India, not more than the typical suburban American white girl. So I was interested and I decided to commit to that once I got in. And I later found out that there were only six other girls in the program. And I was instantly more excited because I was like, oh my gosh, I have a good feeling about this. In the weeks leading up to it, I was nervous because I knew the plane ride was going to be long. I didn't know anyone. And like I said, I hate flying on airplanes. And I was also nervous because I found out this while I was in India, but I have SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth for people who don't know. So I was experiencing a lot of stomach issues And so I was like, damn, this is going to be something to deal with. And also, especially when I was in India, but also before I was going to India was when I heard a lot of stereotypes about India and about especially food. And oh, you're going to get sick. I was telling people the more I told people about going to India, the more people were convincing me that I was going to get sick. And that's not great to hear. Number one, that's racist. It's based off of like racist ideologies, but it's also not true. And I think that anywhere you go and anywhere you travel, you have the potential to get sick. I was worried, but I was more just worried because my stomach was already not that great.
Tell us, where in India did you go?
So I went a bunch of places. So my home base where I stayed for 2 months was in New Delhi. I lived with
Hmm.
a homestay family for 2 months, not at the same time, not consecutively, but for the entire amount of time, or for 2 out of the 3 months. And then one a portion of those months were spent traveling. So I went to Ganj in the Himalayas. I went to Goa. I went to Mumbai with my friends. And then I went to a different region in the state of Maharashtra, which is also where Mumbai is, where I did a research project. And so that was in a more rural region called Jamkhed. And so that was where I spent also a lot of time. But the first week that we got there was an orientation week, and it was very much your body getting used to everything. And I will say my body did go through it. My body did go through it. I think it could have been worse. It could have been better, but I think it was absolutely worth the experience. I was trying to actually, this past weekend, I was trying to downplay it to my stepmom, and she was like, "Didn't you call me multiple times asking if you were gonna die?" Like, I was like, maybe, but that's just part of the experience. That's okay.
There you go. There you go. Well,
Yeah.
it's an interesting phenomenon when we travel to new places and places that are particularly different in their microbiome and what we get challenged by. And everything from the water to vegetables to, well, all the foods. And of course, the spices in Indian food, if they're not familiar to you, takes time to acclimate, but that can be true. You're right. Anywhere in the world you travel that has a different microbiome than what you're accustomed to, and certainly a different dietary approach. I guess I want people to know what you studied and how your public health interest was utilized while you were there.
Yes. So the program focused on public health, gender, and sexuality. We had an epidemiology class and we had a research methods class. And we also took a Hindi class, which was really nice because we got to learn some basic Hindi. Nothing too extensive, but what we could learn in that amount of time. When we were in Goa, we spoke to some people who were part of the queer community, and they told us about what it was like living in Goa as a part of the queer community. We also visited different hospitals, and they have a three-tier health system there. And so there are different levels to it, kind of like how we have urgent care, and then we have the hospital. They have sort of like a suburban health center that's closer by in the villages. This is at least in rural areas. And then there's a slightly bigger hospital that can do more things. And then there's more of like a government hospital. And so we learned a lot about that. We learned a lot about rural healthcare and how that works. And especially where I studied, where I did my independent research project, I got to see how this community health project took care of the health of the neighboring villages. And that was really interesting. We didn't talk too much about how colonization impacted the healthcare system. That was more of a casual conversation, but what I learned about that too was very interesting. I also read a memoir from Gandhi's correspondence that talked a lot about colonization and how that impacted people's lives. We talked about the caste system and how that affects people's access to healthcare and just their quality of life in general. And yeah, I would say in the small moments is when I learned the most, just interacting with people, interacting with my family. I also got a membership to a gym there. As I've mentioned, movement's very important to me. Every day I would get home from my classes around 1 p.m. and I would walk to the gym and I would just really look around and I would talk to some people at the gym. And there was one time I interviewed one of the owners of the gym and I asked him what he thought of when he thought of America. And he said freedom and gymnastics. And I was like, sure, sure. Yeah, no,
It's a
you're
slice
right.
of our life. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
So
that's
let's
America.
let's talk about women in India. And I guess I have one question. Is India a national health system or does it have national and private?
It has national and private.
Okay. So tell me about, women in India are as diverse as women, in the United States, but certainly their culture is different from ours. And gender and sexuality, which is, these are universal phenomenons. Can we hone in a little bit more on studying gender and sexuality in a place like India? It must have
Yes.
been different from what you expected or have experienced here in the States. Can you describe that, please?
Yes. So obviously, this is not everyone's experience what I learned about, and it can't be summarized by myself alone. I mean, I was only there for a handful of months, but what I did learn and what my teachers consistently emphasized to me were that women were not treated as equals. The most disrespected people of all were mothers. They were walked on all over by their husbands and by their children, and that women were really treated as property. And nobody wanted to have daughters. It was much better to have a son, especially to have an older son who could inherit. But having a daughter was a drag for the family because then they would have to find someone for her to marry and they'd have to arrange that whole thing and they wouldn't really get anything in return. And that's what I learned about in class. I also lived with a family and it was much more, I would say, progressive, that family that I lived with. And honestly, a lot like my own in some ways. The daughters bickered with the father, and the father was willing to like make me food and stuff like that. There weren't any, from what I could see, major power dynamics. But what I learned about in school, at least, were these power dynamics and how awfully women, young women especially, were treated. And I didn't expect it, honestly, and also witnessing it as well. And some of my other friends who lived with different homestay families would see the way that their homestay moms would be disrespected by their, homestay brothers or something, or the husband. And most of the time, the women were married very young compared to the man. And especially when I did my independent project in rural Maharashtra, a lot of women were married below the age of 18
Mm.
and they really had no choice in the matter. And that was just their life. And it's difficult to talk about because it doesn't almost feel like it's my place because I'm commenting on something that's not my life. And what I'm viewing as suffering is just their life. I might as well explain what my independent project was on. I feel like to
Sure.
add more context, but the way I got to my independent project, what ignited that fire within me was a story that my professor told me about an 11-year-old girl who was married off. No, I think she was 7. She was 7 years old when she was put into this marriage contract with this boy who was like 11. And when she was 11, he passed away in a car accident. And from then on, she was a widow. She was a widow at 11, even though she had never even like experience life, but she could never marry again. And she just had to live in her family's household. And then that was it. And then like live with her brother eventually. And that story made me so upset. I thought about it for days and just how her whole life and her opportunity for romantic love was just robbed from her. And I remember saying this in my class that she didn't know what she was missing. And I said this a few times, and sometimes this would evoke laughter because we would be talking about sex and pleasure, and I would say, like, they don't know what they're missing, and people would laugh. But it's like they don't. And it's horrible because it is expected for women. I mean, this is an expectation everywhere, but is expected for women to bring the man pleasure. But in a lot of cases there is never that even opportunity. There's not even the knowing that that exists, you know? And that made me really upset. And so I ended up studying how sex education at this rural comprehensive health project that was also a hospital, how their sex education impacted women's understanding of sexual pleasure. And I also wanted to investigate women's sex lives and how this sex education impacted their sex lives as a whole. And
Mm.
that was very telling.
I'd
I'll
love to
take a
hear the
second to
results. I
pause.
mean, sexual health literacy is something that we're still talking about in the States, right? As more and more sex ed gets left behind in public schools where the curriculum are being changed based on which state you live in. And so I wonder about sexual health literacy in India, but in particular, what you learned from that project and how it may have impacted, how you think about it vis-a-vis our own country.
Yeah, so I went in to this project as a very upset person. I was upset for that story that I
Yeah,
heard, and I was upset from what I had learned of all these women. You can't even count how many that this is their, that is just their life. And then who gives me the right to have my life? You know what I mean? And so a big lesson that I learned. So before I started my research project, I had a conversation with my professors, and they told me that when I do the interview process, I need to not be so empowered. And I also need to not make any assumptions. I need to not connect my idea of sexual pleasure with their idea of sexual pleasure. I need to go in with a completely open mind, clean slate, and try and have questions be the least suggestible as possible. They need to
is
just be
that
very
hard?
open-ended. That was very hard. And
Yeah.
I really tried. I really, really tried. And even at the end, as I was finishing my paper, I was like, damn, I screwed up. I screwed up because I went into the interview process with my own definition of consent.
Mm.
I had conducted about, I think, 13 interviews, a few with the village health workers, which village health workers are women that are selected from community villages to maintain the health of the community. And they also teach sex education, and they teach it in these groups of about 10 women, at least in this specific area.
And are they only taking care of other women or do they take care of the
They
men
take
as
care of
well?
everybody. They take care of
Okay.
everybody.
Hmm.
Mostly men will do the group stuff with men, and women will do the group stuff with women, but village health workers are always women, and people always come to the village health workers for health related questions. But there's a thing called women's group and men's group, and that's typically operated by the respective sex. But these women that I interviewed had been giving me pretty clean answers in the sense that I would ask, does your, do you like take consent? Like, does your husband ask for consent? And they would just say yes. They wouldn't really expand on it. And I would just take their yes. And my last interview, I had asked, does your husband ask for consent? And the woman said yes. But the more we were talking, the more it seemed like he had pressured her. And I was writing up all my data, and I was analyzing it, and I was writing about it. And I was like, you know what? I actually just left it at that. Like, I left my question at that. I just said, did they ask for consent? And they all said yes, because why would they say no? Why would they give a bad impression of their husband or their life? Why would they say, no, my husband doesn't ask for consent? in front of another village health worker who was my translator? Why would they say that? And they wouldn't. And I realized also that I had my own expectation of consent that was not theirs. And I looked at my research and I was like, damn, I really tried.
Well, I think you're pointing out, some real challenges around science, right? And investigation and the biases that come in. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, there are such implicit biases, and that's difficult. Also, finding how to cross over cultural boundaries, language. This is very challenging. And it strikes me also that, how could you, again, spending only 3 months in a place that has such a different cultural environment than your own, it takes time to understand others, even in our own environment. To truly understand others, it takes time, it takes empathy, and it takes a willingness to ask questions. But you're right, the way we ask questions of each other can skew the data, right? So be easy on yourself. You're a young investigator, but you're right. I think that points out how often investigations, scientific investigations, are flawed. But you learn from it, and that's good. So, as you implied, gender violence exists across the globe. And how do you see that in the context of public health? How we might speak about it even to women listening in our own country who are experiencing gender violence?
Gender violence carries a lot of shame, and it is something that everyone wants to hide and be very hush hush about. Like I mentioned, this is only a small example, but with my interviews, women didn't want to share if their husbands were hurting them because that almost brought as much shame to them as you would think it would bring to their husbands. And it
Right.
women saw that as a reflection of themselves, like it's their fault. And that's not just a thing in India, that's everywhere. I think that it should be taken much more seriously, and different types of violence should be discussed. I feel like we only think of violence as physical violence. We don't think of emotional violence and intentful, hurtful, manipulative emotional violence at that. I think it should be taken more seriously and more widely discussed. And also somehow working on combating that shame of that common theme of women being the ones who feel shameful for it, somehow tackling that stigma of it's the woman's fault or she must be doing something wrong, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes, shame is such a large part of, quite frankly, all aspects of women's health. Women have felt shame around their bodies for so long. There's shame around the lack of understanding, shame around the violence perpetrated against our bodies. And it's a pandemic. It really is. And so I've thought about how, gender violence exists not only in our own culture, but everywhere else. Historically, public health, international health, were companies, organizations that were run by men. And I'm curious whether there was any conversation about the greater number of women studying public health and the impact on both local and distant communities as a result of that. I mean, here you were, a young woman in India doing the work, studying. You mentioned there were 9 other women. How many men were in the group?
There were zero. It was me. There were seven of us in total. Yeah, so it was all women. I mean, we all got really close. We had many conversations that I feel like we would have been less open to having if there were a man present. And I would say, at least from the health system perspective, interviewing the women who had experienced the sex education in these groups of women was life-changing for them. Having their education, their sex education be facilitated by a woman was very, very powerful. And it gave them a very special opportunity that they don't typically have in their normal busy week to be able to share things about their lives and to learn from other women and have women kind of exchange the weird womanly phenomenons that happen in our
Across the
strange
globe. That's
in our
right.
strange magnificent bodies. Just having other women to talk about it with was really powerful for them and often brought them out of their shells in some form or another.
Yeah. Ruthie, tell me, what do you want listeners to know about this journey of yours? What would you say on a personal and in a way a professional, as a person who's pursuing public health? How do you think about this journey and what it taught you? You've already mentioned this concept of how to ask questions in your investigations and how better understanding how language can be very subjective, and we need to be careful of that. And I think about that vis-a-vis my own office experience when I'm asking women about their histories and trying to be as objective as possible, yet sympathetic, empathetic. What do you want listeners to know about what you brought home and what you want to pursue, I guess?
Okay. I learned how to be a better learner, as you just mentioned, be more objective with my questions, but also keep an open mind and come in with no expectations. I think that was the best thing that I did for myself. Even when people were feeding me all these things about India and how my experience would go from their point of view, I really went in with an open mind and everything just felt like a gift. So I would say
Mm.
have an open mind. Another thing I think that people should, if they have the means to, travel to different places where their world can be expanded. Obviously, not everyone can do that, but those who can, traveling to new places that can expand their world and also to have an open mind, that would be good. I also think that as a white person, I have never felt really, I mean, being a woman is one thing, but as a white person, I've never felt out of place or unsafe in any given setting I've been in ever. And I've never been the minority in the room because of just where I came from and the type of college I'm at. I've never felt like that. Being in India was the first time that I was ever made aware of the fact that I am blaringly white. And that was a really powerful experience that I think every white person should have because you really, for the first time, feel like you stick out like a sore thumb. And it makes you feel very aware of how you carry yourself. And this is the experience of so many different groups of people. And for me, who has never experienced that, it was so eye-opening. And I think it made me a more aware and I would say just a more aware person. I think that was a really powerful experience, one that I didn't expect to happen, but that I felt as soon as I stepped off the airplane and I would get looks from everybody, or people would look twice, or that sort of thing.
I
And
think it teaches us compassion when we
yeah,
know, when we experience that vulnerability, because we feel vulnerable when we are otherized. And so being compassionate around that is such an important lesson, and hopefully something that everyone uses in their daily lives. And certainly something that right now we're missing in this country is
yeah,
compassion and an interest in understanding folks who are different from us. Yeah,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think that it definitely made me a better person. I already considered myself to be compassionate, but I had never had an experience like that that really put that in my body of just being that aware, especially traveling by myself and walking around and having people look at me and know that I look different. I've never experienced that before, and why would I? I live here. So, but it was very powerful and one that I did not expect to have. So it was
yeah.
a powerful surprise.
I'd like to say to listeners, as Ruthie's pointed out, not everyone has the opportunity to travel internationally, but I would suggest to you even going to a different state, in a different part of the country will expose you to differences and be provocative in terms of the diet, in terms of the climate, in terms of the culture, and how important it is to experience it as best as you can because it is expansive. It just helps us grow and learn and be more compassionate. So you mentioned early on, and it's probably another podcast, but this concept of colonialism, and I've done international medical work, and I always ask myself before and after, like, did I contribute or did I take away? Did I exploit or did I expand? And my sense is that part of what you learned was how to contribute and not just to, take away. But can you speak a little bit about, was there conversation about that? Was there conversation about, colonial patterns versus true global health support?
There was conversations about tourism versus education, and one specific example comes to mind. We went on a tour of a slum, which are very common in Delhi and recognized by the government. Some of them are recognized by the government. And before we went there, everybody was feeling a little bit uneasy in our group. We were kind of thinking, like, this is a little weird. We're coming in here as all Americans looking at people's homes kind of like they're, like with a fascinated eye. It just felt a little strange. And so we voiced these concerns to our professors, and they were sort of like, well, you guys are public health students, and this is what public health officials do here. They check on people and they look at their health status of the community and that sort of thing. And I think even though we felt uneasy, the way that that whole day was structured was really nice. We learned about different types of slums in India and the types of health problems that are more prevalent in those areas. And then we saw one for ourselves and we talked to a health professional who worked there and talked about population health in that area. And then we went back to the classroom and we talked about it and we talked about how we felt. And we kind of just kept doing that with every different place that we would explore. And I
Mm,
thought that was really powerful because it really focused us on our mission of what we were there to do. We did not want to be tourists and to also just look with fascination. We wanted to learn. It's difficult to practice the difference. You can kind of know the difference, but in practice, it can be hard to actually carry that out. And I think it's important to keep, like you said, when you go to different places, you ask yourself those questions afterwards. I think that's important to check yourself and to
yeah.
check your purpose. And if you're having any like internal biases in your head, to kind of check yourself. I think that that is really important.
Yeah. For me, true global health support encourages local leadership as opposed to some, foreign government, that those of us who come in are asking, like, what do you want to solve? Not, I think you need to solve this, but what do you want to solve? And that, funding is transparent and that the community is part of it. That you just empower the community around what you're doing as opposed to coming in and saying, I know all and this is how we're going to do it. You have to respect people's culture and embrace it and have them lead the journey as opposed to you doing it. And so it sounds like your professors were really understanding that, well, in a way, you were practicing home health care. That you can't practice home health care unless you're seeing somebody's home. And if you've never seen a ghetto or you've never seen a slum, and you've lived in, middle class America all your life, you have to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think checking your mindset of how you're viewing it, you're not going in there to fix things. And especially coming from a more, and this was a reoccurring idea, but coming from a more empowered place does not mean that you should ever put yourself on a pedestal and look down at anything. You're really there to learn. You need an open mind, and that is something that we were constantly discussing there.
Yeah. How to be discerning without being judgmental. How to take in information without microprocessing through all of our prejudices and mythologies. Yeah, it's a great lesson. So we're coming to a close, and I like to ask my guests one last question, and that is when you are not studying, although maybe that gives you pleasure, but I want to know what gives you pleasure. And it can be anything. But so for so long, women were not asked what gave them pleasure and certainly didn't speak out loud about it. So we're using GynoCurious as a platform to talk about pleasure. What gives you pleasure?
I remember I've listened to your podcast before, and I remember listening to these parts of the podcast, and I always was interested in hearing what the respondents say. And I remember one time I was driving home and I was listening to this, and I was thinking, what gives me pleasure? And the first
Mm,
thing that came to mind were my friends. I
mm,
would say I'm a very social person, and being around my friends, having good conversations is really what brings me joy in life. I love to laugh with them. I love to make them laugh. And I love to hear the way that they look at the world. And honestly, one of my favorite parts of being in India we're meeting people, meeting new people. I had the loveliest homestay family. I got very close with my homestay sisters. I learned so much from them, and I got to spend such good time with them. And also the other women that I went abroad with were so lovely, and it made the experience truly magical being able to reflect with such an intelligent, kind group of young women. It was so awesome. It was so awesome. And that is definitely what brings me pleasure is speaking to other kind, awesome people.
Well, community is part of how we stay well. We know this. There's science that demonstrates that our health is improved when we are in community. So I'm so glad that that brings you pleasure because it also is bringing you health and well-being. And there is nothing like laughing with our friends. So may you have plenty of it. Ruthie, thank you for joining me today on Gyno Curious.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. And thank you to Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud, the co-producers of the show, to David Hoffman, my editor, and to the Epicurean, who allows us to be here and creates this studio for us. And to all of my listeners, I'm really so grateful for you listening. Again, please follow the show and share and stay well. Please listen to your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers not to be ignored. Be well.